I suppose I could, like, hold the books in my hand that I read, because some of them were physical, but I don't want to. I feel like I didn't do anything funny in this video, and so I don't know what to put at the beginning of it. I thought I would just come back and say I'm sorry. I mean, it's not like the opening is usually, like, super funny. This is me saying, hey guys, pretend that in the place of this is something amusing, and stick around to watch the video after this intro. Okay, bye. Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel, Reading in the Dark. My name is Byron and I read, sometimes, in the dark. This is going to be my wrap-up video for the month of September, which was an awesome month for my reading, especially considering the months that came before, which were months during which I didn't read at all. So, nailing it. Kind of doing this one on the fly. I don't have any notes prepared or anything, so I'm going to grab my phone. And I'm going to look up what I read because I don't remember. So it's October 2nd. I meant to film this yesterday and have this video up today, but I'm filming it today and I'm going to have it up tomorrow. And that doesn't mean much to you, but that's my inner monologue. So September was interesting because I read almost all books by Black authors. And I say almost because I also took part in a 2-day Queer Lit Readathon where I read 2 books by white gay authors about the gay queer experience. I had both of those books already, actually. And I read almost all of the books that were originally in my February TBR for my Reading Black Authors for Black History Month video, which I will link in the cards right here. So if I go onto my Goodreads, I'll go to my books that I have read and I'll see my ratings. The first book that I read in September was actually a book that I started in February, and I think I technically finished this book maybe August 31st or something, but I haven't talked about it yet, so I'm going to talk about it now, which is Washington Black by Edugyan. This book, you probably know about, tells the story of a young boy who is a slave named Washington Black, who is sort of chosen by the eccentric scientist inventor brother of the master on this sugar plantation to be his assistant in his experiments, where he's creating an airship that's going to fly and no one believes that it will fly, and then he steals him. So they get into the airship and they go away, and the rest of his life is that we read about is very much defined by his relationship with that white man whose name is Titch. And this book tells like his whole saga, like his whole life story up through the time that the abolition of slavery becomes a thing, not in the United States, but in the areas that concern the characters in this book. I really, really, really enjoyed this book. Even though it took me so long to read, that has nothing to do with the book quality itself. I loved it. The first time that I sat down to read this book was in February. I read over 100 pages, like all at once. And then I had to go to sleep. But I loved this book. I really enjoyed the relationship between Washington Black and Titch, because Titch is not a perfect character. He's not a white savior character. He's sort of enigmatic and hard to figure out, and he's not always there. And Washington Black discovers a lot of things about himself, including an interest that he has academically, and the book doesn't linger on any sort of like romance or anything, really delves into an exploration of this young man character, Washington Black, and it was just a really engaging read, and I thought it was beautifully told and beautifully written. In my Goodreads review, I said, it's an odyssey of sorts, a young man's journey towards freedom and a slow tumble towards understanding what freedom truly is, which is a dramatic way of saying something that I think is true, which it is very much a sort of rumination on what freedom is and what it means to you and the literal, legal, and personal definitions of freedom. I guess I found the end of this book a little jarring and sort of abrupt, and it's one of those things where the ending is actually pretty great and it makes perfect sense. It's probably what it needed to be, but it was very jarring to me at the time. Have you ever had the experience, especially on a Kindle, where you turn the last page and you don't think it's going to be the last page and you're expecting some kind of denouement, and then you turn the page and it says acknowledgements, and you're like, wait, what? So then you go back. That happens to me all the time, and that happened in this book. Suddenly it was acknowledgements, and I was like, oh. So I went back and reread the last few pages just with the knowledge that it was the end of the book. I think that must be why I gave this book 4 stars instead of 5, because the ending left me so shocked. Looking back on it, I sort of regret not giving it 5 stars. But it's been about a month since I read it, so I'm going to respect the 4-star rating that I gave it originally. The next book that I read was The Changeling by Victor LaValle. I've heard it said LaValle, so I'm not really sure which is correct. The Changeling tells the story of a man and his wife who have a baby, and then something changes about the man's wife, and then a tragic event occurs, and he spends the rest of the book trying to find his wife and figure out what happened. And it is an entertaining book, but it was very strange to me. I guess I thought I was reading one kind of book, and then all of a sudden it became something else. And I was like, wait, that's the kind of book I'm reading? I don't know what I thought. I think I thought this was going to be like a fantasy book, but it started out very like realistic and like a story of like a young black couple in New York City. I enjoyed the New York City aspect because I lived there for 7 years. And then it turned, and the best analogy I can give is if you've ever seen the film The Forgotten, starring Julianne Moore and Dominic West and Alfred Woodard. That movie does the same thing, where like you're watching the movie and you think you know what you're watching, and then there's a moment where it turns into something else and you're like, but what? I felt lots of whiplash during this book. I thought it was sort of uneven, maybe tonally, and I thought the ending was a little silly. So I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it, and I gave it 3 stars. Okay, then I read a short story anthology. It's called New Suns, edited by Nisi Shawl. This is a collection of speculative fiction written by authors of color, and this was really, really a fun read. I can't go into every single story. There were some stories here about, future worlds, dealing with how we have children and race, and stories about magic and all kinds of stories, speculative fiction, running the gamut of speculative fiction. They were, for the most part, written really, really well, and I find it really hard to talk about an anthology of short stories in a review because it's a book, but there are so many stories in it, all by different authors. There was a foreword by LeVar Burton, and I really enjoyed Nisi Shawl's afterword. All of the world building in this book was great, pretty much across the board. Favorite stories in this, I would say, definitely were The Virtue of Unfaithful Translations by Min-Soo Kang. That story was so brilliant. Fictional, like a historical account of how these two translators between these two warring factions in this world managed to mistranslate the interactions between the leaders that they served in order to avert war. And it was really, really cute and fascinating. Also, Burn the Ships by Alberto Yanez. This was a story about, I think, indigenous people facing basically annihilation by white people, and a woman who is willing to sort of break tradition to use ancient magic to protect her people, and her husband doesn't like it, and it was just badass. I loved this story, and I need to look up this author to find out more that they've written because, wow, I loved it. And then another 5-star story in here was Blood and Bells by Karen Lowachi. This was sort of a dystopian future urban landscape, a world in which it almost sort of felt like there were warring factions of all people of color who had been growing up in like essentially a ghetto situation and fighting amongst themselves, and the path towards peace that is found for a small select group of people in this world has to do with a man who lost his child because the other sort of gang claimed that the child belonged to them for reasons, and this story also just really stuck out for me because of the world building and because of the emotional life of the protagonist. I really loved it. So there were a lot of stories in this book, but I averaged all of the ratings together and gave New Suns as a collection 4 stars. Highly recommend. Then I read The Revisioners by Margaret Wilkerson Sexton. So this book tells the story of multiple women in different time periods. There's present day Ava, who is going to live with her grandmother Martha, her white grandmother. Ava is black, and her grandmother is white. And she's getting on in years, and she wants someone to give her company, and so she's actually going to pay Ava the salary that she was getting from the job she was laid off from. in order to live with her and give her company. And her son is in high school and he doesn't want to go, but then they start to get comfortable and he makes friends in the high school in the area, and they're white friends, and it makes Ava uncomfortable, but he really likes his new friends. And Martha is deteriorating and has sort of woken up a little bit in the last few decades about race, but as her mind goes, she starts to slip back into racist attitudes and sort of these random racist outbursts. And the sort of comfort and discomfort that Ava feels living in her grandmother's home because of how it normally is, but the fear of those moments when those old attitudes are going to come out, is a really, really compelling read. And then it also tells the story of Ava's ancestor, Josephine, as both a grown woman in, I think, 1924, and as a young girl in the late 1800s, with her family when I think they were all slaves. Back in the 1920s, Josephine slowly, warily befriends or is befriended by a white woman named Charlotte, and that relationship becomes really complicated when she discovers that Charlotte's husband is a member of the Klan. There's a magical realism element going on in this story, and it is so cool. It's just such a great read, and I loved the history, I loved the relationships and the writing, I loved the story, I thought it was a beautiful book, and I gave it 5 stars. I then read Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is part 1 of a trilogy, and I did not get to parts 2 and 3 yet, but I'm going to read them really quickly in the first few days of this month, October. Binti is a science fiction story about a black woman named Binti, whose people in the future on Earth live isolated from the rest of society in their own area and in their own ways. And they cover their skin in this sort of mud-like material that has healing properties and is very traditional and important to their culture. And she is leaving home to go to Uzma University. And this is a violation of the traditions of her people. You're not supposed to leave. She's a brilliant mathematician. And she has this ability to do something called treeing, where she kind of leaves her like conscious mental state in the here and now and kind of goes into a mathematical like reverie of sorts that helps her to concentrate and focus and organize her thoughts really, really well, and to accomplish things with her mind that ordinary people cannot when she comes out of that state, which is really, really cool. She and everybody else on the spaceship that is taking them to the university, they're attacked by the Medusa, which is a mortal enemy of humans, and she makes contact with one of the aliens. She's the only one that they don't kill because of an object that she has in her possession that she found as an artifact, and she doesn't know what it is or how it works, but it's protecting her, and she slowly learns why it's protecting her, and she manages to try to broker peace between the two people. And it's sort of like a story about like the chosen one kind of thing, racial discord, and a young woman with ambitions to go beyond what her people have always done in the past. It was a really great read. It was very short. It was like under 100 pages, and I loved it. I was spacing this trilogy out. I wanted to like read a big novel, do one of these Binti novellas, and then read a big novel, and then do one of these Binti novellas. But then An American Marriage took me a minute, and then I had to put it on hold for the Queer Weekend. And then when I got back, I only had enough time left to finish American Marriage, and I didn't get to the Bintis 2 and 3, Binti Home and Binti The Night Masquerade, so I'm going to read them soon. Super, super loved this novella. I gave it 4 stars, and I'm really looking forward to parts 2 and 3. Oh boy. Then I read 50 Words for Rain by Asha Lemmie. This is a new novel by a debut novelist about a young woman named Noriko who goes by the nickname Nori. So essentially this is a young woman who is half black and half Japanese. And her mother had an affair, committed adultery, and conceived her during this affair with this American soldier who was black. And she is the shame of her family because of her skin being darker and her hair being curly, and she's left on the doorstep of her grandmother's grand palatial estate by her mother when she's a little girl. And they raise her, but in order to avoid shaming the family, and they don't want anyone to know that she even exists because she's a reminder of their daughter's betrayal and the dishonor that she brought upon the family, in order to avoid that all coming out, her grandmother, Yuko, keeps her in the attic, and she's raised in the attic. There's a kindly maid named Akiko who is loving but stern, and at the end of the day is loyal to Yuko. And this is her life, living in the attic, subjected to chemical baths where they try to bleach her skin to make it lighter. And they're trying to straighten her hair, and they're pulling on her hair with brushes really, really hard. And she's just basically taught to internalize racism against herself, to hate her own appearance and her skin and her hair, and to try and wonder her whole life why her mother abandoned her, and she's waiting for her to come back and get her. Until her brother, Akira, shows up and discovers that she's living in the attic and spends the rest of the novel advocating on her behalf for her right to live outside of the attic and to go outside and to leave the building, and for the right to have some kind of an education besides just the basics, and teaches her music. He's a brilliant violinist, and he starts to teach her music and starts to teach her the violin. And I'll leave it there. It is a gorgeous novel. It is historical fiction, obviously. It's set in the 40s and 50s. And it's like a love story. It tells a story of Nori learning to love herself and to come to terms with the abandonment at the hands of her mother. Some people have called this like a romance novel, because in some ways, platonically, it is sort of like a romance between her and her brother in a platonic way, because it is very much about familial love and his support and all of that. But I honestly think of it as a love story between her and herself, because in the beginning of the book, she very much has internalized this hatred for herself and her appearance. And thanks to sort of like the nudge that she gets from her brother early on, she learns to not hate herself anymore. And this book was so beautiful. I had to put it down and cry a few times. I love stories that take place over many, many years, and this book moves briskly through time. So this is an epic life story. It has a lot to say about race. It has a lot to say about family, forgiveness, and I love the fact that music is a large component to sort of the process of healing in this book. I loved this book so much. I gave it 5 big stars and highly, highly recommend it. Highly. Big time. The next 2 books that I read were for the Queer Lit Readathon, so I won't go into too much detail on them because I did reviews of them in my wrap-up for the Readathon, which I will link right here. And the first was The 5 Stages of Andrew Brawley by Shaun David Hutchinson, which tells the story of a young man whose mother and father and younger sister, which constitutes his entire nuclear family, are killed in a car accident, but he survives and secretly stays in the hospital and lives there, and nobody knows who he really is. Then a boy named Rusty is brought into the hospital who has suffered horrible burns all over his body, as a victim of a hate crime, and it's a story of them getting to know one another. And it is also very, very beautiful, and I cried many, many times. It is a beautiful book. It's young adult, very heavy. I gave it 5 stars. I adored it. And the next book that I read for the Queer Weekend was A Density of Souls by Christopher Rice. This is a mystery thriller. It is Christopher Rice's debut novel. It's sort of the reason that he initially was sort of labeled as like a gay author. This tells the story of a young man who is gay, named Stephen, who has best friends. There's a girl and then there's 2 guys, and they're all best friends. And then they move into high school, into this prestigious, I guess, private high school in New Orleans, which is where they all live. And he's sort of cast aside, and they move on to be popular, and he is ostracized in the school for being gay. And it's heartbreaking, but there's a mystery, and there's a tragic event that takes place in the town, and they come back years later, and you learn more and more about what really happened during that tragic event, and learn a lot more about the relationships between these friends and what was going on before they were in high school, what was going on while they were in high school, and it is juicy. Like, the revelations in this book. I say a lot more about this book in my wrap-up, but I really enjoyed this book. It was a little over the top. It was a little outrageous, so it strained a little bit of credibility at times, but it was a fun ride, and I gave it 4 stars. The last book that I read this month, unfortunately, was a 3-star read for me, even though most people love this book, so oh well, go figure. It was An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. It tells the story of a black couple, Roy and his wife, Celestial, who are married and they're staying in a hotel. He goes to get ice, and then another woman needs his help with something, and later she accuses him of sexual assault. And we know he didn't do it. And his wife knows he didn't do it. But he serves a portion of a 12-year sentence in prison for it. So this is the story of their marriage and what happens to them as a couple as a result of his incarceration, and a story of like how he tries to put his life back together after he is exonerated half-heartedly by the state and gets out. But basically, I feel like I kind of got in line for the wrong ride here. I wanted this book to be more about the legal aspect of it and more about what really happened and less about a marriage, which is really my bad because it's literally called An American Marriage. The book is it's really about Roy and Celestial and their families and their parents and their backstory and her friend Andre and how it's complicated. And there's lots of letters back and forth between Roy and Celestial, and it's a great book. It's beautifully written. This is a great story, and it needs to be told, and a lot of people really loved it. But I found myself really bored reading about just the slow dissolution of this relationship, or is it they argue and they fight, and then they make up, and then they get better, and then they drift apart, and then it turns into a love triangle. There's nothing more tired to me than a love triangle story. I do not. If I never read another love triangle story in my life, I will be fine. And it's just the marital drama of straight people, and I don't care. I have spent my entire life consuming media, films and TV shows and books and music, all about fucking straight people. I've never been in love with anyone who was wrongly sent to prison, and I've never been sent to prison for something I didn't do. So I'm not saying I don't care about that. I definitely do, and that's what I wanted the story to be more about. And another part of the reason for that is that I did not like Roy. I'm really tired of reading about straight people, but I'm also, and it could be that the fact that I went and read a lot of queer fiction in the middle of this book and then came back to it didn't help. But also, Roy is one of those guys he's constantly trying to share this like, I don't know, this like straight dude colloquial wisdom about women. Every time he did that, I just rolled my eyes. Like, there was a line where he was like, when a woman locks the door, picking the lock won't let you back in. I'm like, that's just true of everyone. Like, respect people's wishes? Is that what you're saying? Because that's true of people. That's true of humans. I don't understand why men always act as though women are so inconceivable and so incomprehensible and their emotions are so weird. Like there's some alien species or something that needs to be decoded and figured out. Like he's freaking Jodie Foster in Contact. Actually, women are just people. And if you want to understand women, understand people. That's just me having a problem with straight men. And that reared its head a lot in this book. I just had a lot of moments where I was like, dude, you're an idiot. I didn't like him. That's me just coming out and saying it. I didn't like Roy. I didn't like reading most of what he had to say. That said, his relationship with his father was great to read. And I specifically liked the parents in this book. Celestial's parents and Roy's parents. All of their scenes were some of my favorites. I liked them the best. I liked the older generation a lot better than the younger generation that the book is supposed to be about. So I didn't have the greatest time reading this book for all of those reasons, and I feel a little bit funny about saying it out loud. Maybe it's just not a book for me. It's probably not. Maybe this is not a book that is intended for the white gaze, but then I also sort of feel like it's not a book that is intended for the gay gaze, for the gays, because I just found myself so frustrated, and he exhibited so many traits about stereotypical traits that make me crazy, and so that pulled me out of it because I just didn't like him. So that was my experience of what is most likely a very wonderful book that I gave 3 stars. Sorry. So those were all of my reads in the month of September. I haven't read for a couple of days now because I decorated my house for Halloween. And I'm preparing for my big birthday party tomorrow with my sister because we both have birthdays that are around this time in October, and we're just celebrating them together tomorrow. My whole family's coming over very, very soon. I need to make a video about the changes that will be taking place in the plans that I posted about October because so many things have changed. So many times since I posted that video. So I'll be posting that video soon because I have some amendments to my October plans, I'm hearing like knocking on the side of that wall of my house. I don't know why. Anyway, those were my reads for the month of September. I had an amazing reading month. I averaged 4.1 stars for the books that I read, which is really, really good. I read a lot of literary fiction and historical fiction, and I really love both of those genres, so that's probably why. But yeah, so if you have any comments about the books that I read this month, like if you need desperately to let me know what a horrible person I am for not loving An American Marriage, feel free to write that below. The comment box is your friend, at least for now. And if you enjoyed this video, please do hit that thumbs up button and give me a like. Helps me out a lot more than you know with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you have not yet done so already, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's really super easy to do. In fact, it's on the end screen now. So that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one. And until next time, I will be here in the dark reading.